Why? Mother, why? Curse you! Curse you!
Wandering Oscar, a story written by Stephen Sinclair, narrated by Naya Nomikou. 1. His name was Wandering Oscar, and he was a skeleton. He lived on a wooded hill in one of those in-between places you get in England. On one side, the wood ran down to a busy road. On the other, fields and more woods. About 3 miles beyond these was a low embankment along which a branch railway line had once run. The trains had annoyed Oscar and his friends. He was glad when it closed. Beyond this, the land dropped away into flat, windswept country, probably once marsh, now long since drained. Then a distant line, the sea. People sometimes came and cut the grass at the roadside, but nobody bothered about his hill, and hardly anybody ever went there. It was a tangled rocky mass of weeds, stunted ivy-choked trees, and thorn bushes, with a wider, more open space at the top. Oscar had lived on his hill ever since the first Elizabeth had been queen. At that time, he'd lived in a cottage that had stood there in a clearing. But that was long gone. Not a trace left. And he'd only lived there for a few days. The spot was now all overgrown. At that time, he wasn't called Wandering Oscar. His name had been Lord Henry de Courtenay, sometimes also Handsome Harry or Harry the Devil. He'd been a tall, well-favoured young man from a wealthy family of the high gentry, a brilliant student at Oxford, and when his father died and he inherited the lands and title, a favourite at court. Although later, when the rumours started, almost nobody would admit he had even existed. Never mind that they had thought him a fine fellow and the best of company. It was once said that when he came to rule Scottish, James declared that he would have had yon devil Harry Courtenay hanged. Perhaps the only handsome young man the king would have condemned in this way. 2. For a time it had seemed that the world lay at his feet. Here perhaps had been the problem. Henry was enraged by the fact that this would not always be so, by the knowledge that he must grow old and die. In his arrogance and pride, this offended him. What made it worse was the fact that he suspected it need not be so. His mother, Margaret, was a Delacour of the Anchester Delacours of Hexham Priory. Always there had been stories about her family. Rumours. Dark ones. Handsome Harry happened to know that the stories were substantially true. Not only had she told him things, she had shown him things. It was said that when he visited Baron Hexham, his grandfather had told him other things, and that he had been initiated into the feast of Magna Mater. It was from his mother that he first heard of the forbidden volume, the Liber Nefastus Nomina, and what it was said to make possible. It's not even inconceivable that she came to regret this, although she was not normally troubled by what she would have called peasant scruples. As wandering Oscar, he would often scream into the darkness of the night, consumed by unending rage, regret, and pain.
Why? Mother, why? Curse you. Curse you.
Of course, he chose not to remember that she had warned him. She had not objected to his esoteric interests, had encouraged them. She only took exception to the direction. Said that Neoplatonist magic written by a coterie of Lower Empire wretches was unworthy of her son. She dismissed the Book of Unlawful Names as
essentially a Christian work. By hating the Galilean god of sheep, those foolish men entered his truth. And as I have tried to explain, Henry, there is more than one truth. If you take all their puerile symbols literally, you will bind yourself to them and make them real. Make the cursed shepherd's law true. I warn you, I, whose father is lord of the twilight city and the hidden hordes of cattle. And besides, she added, there are other gods than little Satan. She'd also reminded him of the terrible dangers involved if it didn't work. But Lord Henry wanted to live forever, as he was then, young, handsome, and strong, in this world. In his terrible pride and hubris, he thought the only thing abominable was the idea he wouldn't always exist. Madam, when it's the 20th century and I rule this world as its immortal Caesar, my word shall be the only truth and law. Your family's little culinary eccentricities, long forgotten. 3. Lord Henry had the wealth and influence to make his ambition come true. Not only were his lands and wealth huge, he also had a controlling share in a large percentage of the merchant ships that sailed from London and Bristol, and therefore, in those days, a large share in all such profitable ventures in the world. He also correctly thought the ships would be useful in other ways. He obtained a copy of the Liber Nefastus Nomina with relative ease. A former monk had stolen a copy from one of the dissolved monasteries. The man, a hopeless drunk, had sold it to one of his agents for a relative pittance. The book provided a kind of hellish inventory of the various elements that were needed, and then details of the ritual to be performed. First, a piece of the true cross. This had not been a great difficulty. He was a nobleman whose family was still half Catholic half the time, at least in secret. He obtained several pieces to try and ensure one was genuine. The bodies of 13 unnatural births were also easy. Some of these were simply pulled by his minions from the Thames or bought in exchange for pennies from farms. They included a kitten with rudimentary wings, a puppy with 6 legs, and a 3-headed calf. As a crowning glory to make the spell more potent, a baby with 3 eyes. He had the bodies pickled in vinegar and wine. The 13 heads of evil men killed by other evil men, plus those men's lifeblood in turn,
had also been relatively simple. The rookeries of London and Paris were rich hunting grounds. His hirelings well paid and indefatigable, not least because they all knew what a man like him was capable of. The next items had been more troublesome. To secure 6 left hands of priests of the Arian sect presented obvious problems, not the least being that, as far as Lord Henry knew, they had been extinct for centuries, despite what papists might say about Lutherans and other Protestants. Finally, after a long, tiring search of the continent, his agents had discovered in a miserable, incredibly remote village high in the Pyrenees some extant specimens. He was also fortunate that anywhere alive at all, for a plague had killed all but 3 of the grown women and 5 of the men. This handful of survivors had been remarkably fair-haired for the region. He'd been tempted to think they might have Vandal or Gothic blood. They had survived because the place was so hard to get to, and because they were so ignorant they didn't really understand what they were. An inscription, basically ancient graffiti on a rock beside a stream where the woman drew water, "Nonque qualis pater Christus," and certain things said in their almost incomprehensible speech had sealed the fate of one old man. Selected because he sometimes led the others in prayer and could read a few words of Latin, had even known what the words on the rock meant. Then, in a fit of pique because of the long search, Henry had them all killed. It would also, he reasoned, make it impossible for anyone else to follow my glorious experiment. There had, of course, remained the problem of the other 5 left hands. At first he considered using the hands of some of the dead men in the Aryan village. In the end, he decided against this course. He instead used the hands of Mohammedan imams. He reasoned that their beliefs were similar. Besides, his agents in Constantinople could get them easily. The final item had been the most difficult. At times he despaired that it even existed, but finally, success. In the Jewish ghetto of a small city in the Rhineland, a Jewish man who secretly was a devoted, true-believing, baptized Catholic. That the item existed was a delightful relief. As the book instructed, Henry journeyed there himself and killed the man with a stone prized from a certain wall in Jerusalem. Then he had the man burned, the ashes ground to fine powder, and carried away in an earthenware jar. 4. He had now been almost ready. Nothing had been left to chance. He'd had men spy on his man, who had been spied on in turn. He had been very careful. All the elements collected were as genuine as they could be. The elements themselves, by their very nature, meant he had already almost succeeded. He could feel it. Inevitably, perhaps, rumors had started. There had been talk about what Henry the Devil was or was not up to. But every precaution had been taken. And besides, he reflected, he would soon be beyond what they called justice. As he told his mother, his word would soon be the truth and the law. He had enjoyed the last preparation. As the book instructed, he hunted down and killed as many of his own hirelings as possible. He was 34, strong, fast, cunning, sagacious, remorseless, skilled with sword and dagger. And when the ritual was done, he would be immortal and possessed of powers undreamed of. And there was something else. He had noticed that faint reddish raised marks had begun to appear on the palm of his left hand. As of yet, it was impossible to tell exactly what they were, but he thought they were numbers, or the letters that would name a certain number. He was not surprised. He sat admiring them one evening in his chambers at court. He glanced up at his face, reflected in his Venetian looking-glass. Only the other day Elizabeth herself had remarked that he looks a bit like father when he was young, although he's darker. This, despite the gossip. It was time.